Today's video is going to be about the topic of illness. What is illness? What is sickness? What role does it have in our spiritual lives? What does the Torah, what does Judaism have to say about it? So, a little bit of history. If a person looks at the Torah and many of the lives of the early figures in the Torah, they lived very long lives. Methuselah lived for more than 900 years. And it would seem that the way that their lives were created was that God breathed a soul of fire, of his spark of his life into people. It was within them. Then all of a sudden, one day, it was time to go out. There wasn't a sense of decline and illness and transition. Life was in and life was out. Now, our sages say, our tradition says, that as much as this was God's will and is clearly how things were meant to be, it wasn't an easy thing for people to bear. People felt that there isn't that closure that they needed. There isn't that ability to say goodbye. And so we know with the death of Jacob that his death was very different from those who had preceded him. The kind of death that he had was one where he was in a bed, he had an illness. His weakness and his illness were known to people, to his children, and his 12 sons came to the bedside. And with each and every one, he offered to them a blessing, an insight into their exact character, their strengths and their weaknesses, and used this as a guide, as inspiration for their own lives. Clearly his life was one of suffering at the end. There was sickness, and there was pain, and there was weakness. But the context is that it led to a known death. It led to an experience of dying, which provided meaning and purpose to himself and to those after him. And so, in our Jewish tradition, we do see that there's a role for sickness and illness. But at the same time, we have a very deep question that many of us experience. We lose people at a young age. We lose people who are very dear to us when it seems they haven't completed their lives. So we know we have this question. Why do bad things happen to good people? And this happens through sickness. The very thing that I just said a moment ago brought meaning and purpose. So it is a theme in Judaism that we always have to look into suffering. Always have to ask why it's there. The Talmud says, for example, that if a person puts his hand into his pocket, he wants to pull out a nickel, but he only pulls out a dime. That is a sense of something not going his way. That is a sense of suffering. And he should introspect. He should think about, why was that? Why did this happen? Why did this need to be that way? And so surely sickness has that aspect. And that many times we can see the positive sides of sickness. I've had many a patient whose lives went so fast that the only way that they could think about what was important, think about their family, think about their goals, have a closeness with God was when if everything else had to shut down and had to close, and all they could do was focus on that which was in front of them. Some were prepared to do this, and some were not. And certainly I've had families where the blessing of sickness was that you had children who benefited from their parents. Their parents did so much for them. They gave them love and caring and raised them. But there's a sense of these children that, you know what, all my parents gave me, I never properly gave it back. I gave them gifts, I said thank you, but I feel like to be whole myself, to be the recipient of this gift from my parents, I've got to give them something very special. And the last few years of their parents' lives, when they gave up their jobs, when they changed everything significantly to be there for their parents, it was very hard, but it really gave them the sense of groundedness, that they had a purpose, they had a reason in being born by their parents, and that purpose was appreciated by them, and they showed their appreciation by giving back to their parents at their own parents' decline. But this doesn't always apply. We see plenty of people who suffer much more than it would seem they deserve. We see many people suffer way more than they need to get clarity. And furthermore, we have the deeper question of there's a lot of people, for example, in intensive care units, who are on ventilators, who are on long-term life support, where they're not going to be able to do very much. They might have their thoughts, we don't know, but there is a perceived sense of suffering, that they have to just be around in that state and not know what to be, and there isn't what to do. So we have to talk about this too. But the purpose of this video was really just to look at how sickness is part of the dying process, how it does have a positive function, and how it does fit into the general question that we always have to ask ourselves, is why do bad things happen to us, and what is its purpose? Many people said about the famous book that was written by Rabbi Kushner, that it didn't help them personally, that he was honest, he talked about his suffering, why bad things happened to him. He had a child who suffered one of the most horrible diseases, a disease of premature aging. And he had to put aside his faith to a certain extent and come up with a new concept of God, that for him, God couldn't be all-powerful and all-knowing and all-kind. One of those three things had to give: all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-kind. And he wasn't willing to sacrifice that God wasn't kind in his own eyes, even though he could understand it. And he wanted to come up with a conclusion that God just couldn't. God felt for me, God felt bad for me, but this universe that he created, he couldn't stop. So this is one approach to this question. But the traditional Jewish approach is to find meaning, is to dig deeper, and to say there must be a reason for every kind of suffering. But it doesn't mean that we have to find it. It doesn't mean we have to know it. And certainly in the Jewish tradition, not everything is explained to us in this world. So why can't that be one of the things that when we go into the next world, when our life ends, we go to the next world, we can ask God and say, hey, why did this have to happen? I don't understand. And God will have an answer. Rabbi Kushner felt there had to be an answer in this world, but I don't know if that's so clear. So anyways, I hope this video was helpful, talking about the purpose of illness and sickness and suffering, and these are topics we will definitely come to and discuss more in the future.